Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the mornings. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Friday, January 20th, 2023. Careful, a lot of 20s involved. All right, we got through it. I think that's correct. Right? The date is okay. All right. I admit, not too much in the way of preparation this morning. My mind is elsewhere, but high schooler is out the door, so time to focus. Plenty of stories to focus on. I guess I'm disoriented today by the fact that I don't at the moment have any new George Santos news. He hasn't done anything else, or hasn't been discovered to have done anything else particularly egregious in the last 15 to 20 minutes. So I suppose we're in a calm period here in the greater Washington, D.C. area. I don't know where he is at the moment. He could be in New York, could be in Florida, could be in Brazil. We don't really know where he lives or what area he represents, but there you have it. Waiting around, trying to figure out what will be the next worst George Santos story. But it will all be just a distraction from things that are the actual stories, and many of which have waited until Friday to be pulled out of pocket and aired today. So much to get to. Might as well get started on all of it. Now, where to begin, I don't know. But no plan for a flow today, but the stream of consciousness will take us. But there are definitely a couple of things I wanted to catch up on. One, something we haven't talked about in a long time, but I just happened to notice the story today. Probably I should, I don't know whose coverage I should be looking at for this. Although the handiest at the moment is from The Hill, for whatever reason. Alec Baldwin will be facing involuntary manslaughter charges over the shooting on the set of his, is it a TV show or a movie? I don't know which, Rust, which you may remember, when it happened, or that it happened. You probably don't, I don't know. I don't remember exactly when it happened, and maybe the, story will tell us, October 2021. Okay. So it's been a while. But my recollection of the story was, of course, that they were, rehearsing a scene that has, gunplay in it, which is probably a bad idea, just generally speaking, in terms of movie making. I always worry about that because, I read about a lot of accidents. This is not the first time that something like this has happened. But when it does happen, that's the time that they trot out all the stories that should serve as a warning to people not to do this sort of thing. But you don't find out about it until someone else gets shot. And then they tell you about all the other movie sets on which people have gotten shot. And I guess it caught some people by surprise because there was this sense that, Alec Baldwin we know mostly as an actor, and he was, if you're the actor and the people on the set hand you a gun that has bullets in it, you probably don't assume, live rounds. You probably don't assume that there are live rounds in guns that they're handing you, because the rule usually is to hand you guns that have blanks and are just used for filming. And there's a person on the set whose job it is actually a job. The armorer is what they call them. And they work on film sets, and they're professionals, and they're unionized, and the other professional unions working on set usually demand, they won't work on a production that doesn't have a professional armorer for this reason. And they had a professional armorer, just that person was out that day. And the question is, if you screw it up and you hand an actor a gun that has live rounds in it, first of all, there's lots of questions about how that would even happen. What do we just hey, we're going to shoot a scene with guns today. Any members of the crew or passers-by who own firearms, bring them on down, why don't you? And we'll use your gun in the production of this show. Well, no, that's not the way it works. But you normally think, if you hand an actor a gun that's improperly loaded and they practice the scene and shoot at somebody and it turns out to have a live round in it, that's most, I guess, juries would say that's probably the fault of the person who loaded the gun, and we should go and find that person. And I guess usually that's the armorer. But today, in this situation, as I understand it, the armorer was out, but I don't remember very clearly exactly how or why it happened, though I was discussing it at home yesterday, and it seems like it might have been a COVID situation, and that there was protocols in place about how many people you could have on set at the time, because, safety. They didn't want to kill anybody, right? You don't want to have too many people in the COVID era gathered on set. So instead, they said, let's not have the person who makes sure that there's not live bullets in this gun, and then they killed somebody the other way. Now, I thought that there was a pretty good likelihood that they would end up charging Alec Baldwin, because Baldwin was also the producer of this, production. So now I've painted myself into a word corner here. But I thought that it might be considered his fault because he's the one, the producer is he's pushing things along and says, listen, time is money. We can't be waiting around all day for COVID to end so that we can get an armorer back here so that we can check whether the guns don't have live rounds in them. Just give me the gun. I'll put on my actor hat and I'll pull the trigger and we'll see what happens. And it shouldn't work that way. But as it turns out, I understand also, I'll read the story and figure out what we learn from the details of the story. But I'm also given to understand that they're charging him, I guess they don't really charge you this way, but essentially in his role as the actor. That is to say, he's the proximate cause of the gun having been fired. And so they're going to take that to the jury and say, actor schmackter. Somebody handed him a gun that's an actual gun. They told him it was loaded with blanks, and he just believed it and pulled the trigger, and that's unwise. And it actually kind of is. But I think, you'd have a better chance going after him by saying, let's charge him more in the producer hat. And he's the guy that said, yes, we can rehearse, and yes, we can shoot this scene today without an armorer on set. That's really where the fault lies. And I do kind of wonder if that's the case, whether they charged him the other way so that the DA's office could say, well, we charged him, but we're not going to be able to convict him on that. Not likely. Not without bringing in his role as a producer. And we don't want to do that. But we don't really want to convict him either. We want to charge him so that everybody knows we charged him. But hey, the weird vagaries of the legal system, rich guy, you know how it is. It's not our fault that he's not getting held accountable for this. I mean, I assume Alec Baldwin is a reasonably nice guy, and we don't necessarily need for him to be, punished in any way for his other activities. But, I think the straight ahead question about whether or not it was his fault as an actor versus as a producer, that to me, that's straightforward. To everybody else, that's convoluted. Let me read the Hill's story about it and see if we're right about this stuff. Alec Baldwin to face involuntary manslaughter charges over Rust shooting by Judy Kurtz in the Hill. There were also some articles available. There was breaking news everywhere yesterday. Everybody flooded my inbox, but I took this one because the other choice was Vanity Fair, and I don't know. Whatever. But now I'm sure the New York Times is on it, etc. Alec Baldwin will face involuntary manslaughter charges in the shooting death of cinematographer, I don't know how she pronounces the name here, Halyna, Halyna, Halyna Hutchins on the set of the movie, here's the answer to that, Rust. Baldwin and Rust armorer Hannah Gutierrez Reed will each be charged with 2 counts of involuntary manslaughter. Santa Fe District Attorney Mary Carmack Altways said in a Thursday statement. The announcement from the Santa Fe District Attorney came more than a year after the October 2021 fatal shooting of Hutchins, caused by a live round fired from a prop gun by Baldwin, the film's producer and star, while rehearsing a scene on the New Mexico production. The film's director, Joel Souza, also was wounded in the shooting. Baldwin and Gutierrez Reed will not be charged in relation to Souza's injury. That's interesting, too. I think that I don't know whether he was injured, maybe not by the gunfire, but perhaps in the ensuing mayhem. I don't know what the story is there. Rust Assistant Director David Halls signed a plea agreement for a charge of negligent use of a deadly weapon, according to the district attorney's office. If any one of these 3 people, Alec Baldwin, Hannah Gutierrez Reed, or David Halls, had done their job, Halyna Hutchins would be alive today, to tell me how to pronounce her name correctly, I guess. And I don't even know. And I don't even know if I'm misgendering this person now that I think about it. Well, at any rate, it's that simple, although I think it's maybe more complex than that. Andrea Reeb, the special prosecutor appointed by the district attorney, said in a statement on Thursday, the evidence clearly shows a pattern of criminal disregard for safety on the Rust film set, and I think that it does. Each involuntary manslaughter charge carries a potential sentence of up to 18 months in jail and a $5,000 fine. In a statement to ITK, Baldwin's attorney called the district attorney's decision a terrible miscarriage of justice that distorts Halyna Hutchins's tragic death. Baldwin had no reason to believe there was a live bullet in the gun or anywhere on the movie set. Lawyer Luke Nikas said, "We will fight these charges and we will win." And here's where I would differentiate, right? If you're a hired hand actor, then yes, you have no reason to believe that there's a live bullet or live round. They'll say, you can't say live bullet. That's not the right that's not the right word. Don't say clip. Don't say magazine, whatever. But no reason to believe there was a live bullet in the gun. Probably right as an actor. And as a producer, I would say there's no real reason to believe that there's a live round in the gun. But as the producer, it is your job to say, I'm taking care of things by hiring an armorer and making sure that things are done right. Even if it costs more money to shoot this way, we're going to do it. And if you're both producer and actor, somebody has to wear the producer hat here. I can't help it that you've decided to wear two, but as long as you're wearing this one, you've got to be responsible for what goes on the set. Gutierrez Reed's attorney, Jason Bowles, called the charges the result of a very flawed investigation and an inaccurate understanding of the full facts. We intend to bring the full truth to light, Bowles told ITK. I don't know what is that for, like in the know or something? Is that somebody's column? Yeah, okay. And at the Hill, they call it, that's the name of the column that Judy Kurtz is writing here, In the Know. Like, nobody really thinks that, the Hill. Well, of course, they have the In the Know column, but all right, they're trying to brand it. In statements to ITK, right, where were we with this one? Oh, this is the second mention of ITK. Right, Bowles, that's Jason Bowles, the attorney for the armorer, says they intend to bring the full truth to light. So that's nice to know. And they believe Hannah will be exonerated of wrongdoing by a jury. Well, she'll be exonerated by a jury of wrongdoing. It's not the wrongdoing of the jury we're worried about here. The FBI said in a forensic report following its investigation, and remember, this report is forensic. Now, everybody loves that word. Like, we're going to have a forensic audit of the vote here, and forensic means really rigorous, apparently, in their minds. I don't know. Anyway, the FBI said a forensic report following its investigation that the gun that killed Hutchins could not have been fired without someone pulling the trigger. So actually, a forensic in this case means a report. I could have told you that from here. I'm not even close to the set. Yeah, in order to fire a gun, you see what you do is you use one of these finger thingies, and then you press this thingy, and it makes the bang noise. That's how it works. That's forensics. Baldwin and other Rust producers settled a lawsuit with Hutchins's family, which had accused the team behind the film of reckless conduct and cost-cutting measures last October. So I think the real truth was probably landed on there. All of us believe that Halyna's death was a terrible accident. I am grateful that the producers and the entertainment community have come together to pay tribute to Halyna's final work. Matthew Hutchins, the 42-year-old cinematographer's husband, said in a statement following the settlement. All right. Well, following the shooting, Baldwin vowed to never work with real guns on a TV or movie set again. In a TV interview just weeks after the incident, he claimed someone else was responsible for Hutchins's death. I feel that someone is responsible for what happened, the 64-year-old actor said at the time, and I can't say who that is, but I know it's not me. That's, wow. Filming on the movie had been poised to resume this month. It wasn't immediately clear if the charges against Baldwin would affect the production schedule. But, That's some statement. Someone's responsible. I just know it isn't me, even though, there's only about 5 people, maybe, who could be held responsible. Let's see if we can even come up with 5. The actor with the gun in their hand, the producer who says, let's go, even though things aren't right here, the armorer who works with the gun, and the director who says, time to rehearse and or go ahead with the shooting. And then maybe, I don't know, maybe there are production assistants or assistant directors who also have a hand in deciding whether or not they're going to go ahead with rehearsals. So 4 to 6 people, perhaps, who could be at fault here. If we cut it down to like 4 main people, director, producer, actor, armorer, and you're 2 of them, well, it's 50-50 that you're at fault for this situation. I would guess if the chances of any one of you being at fault are all equal. And considering that I had heard originally that the armorer was not on the set that day, I don't know why she's even being charged, but I guess she's, legally responsible for all the weapons on the set. And if she's not there and they break in or use her key or combination to get the weapons and use them, doesn't sound like the armorer's fault, but maybe legally speaking, under their agreements, it is. But if you looked at it that way and you're sitting there as a jury and saying, well, it could be the director who said, let's rehearse, the actor who said, all right, I'll rehearse, the producer who said, we better rehearse because we're losing money and we want to move forward with the production even though the armorer isn't here, or the armorer, right? 4 people, the armorer is absent. You are both producer and actor, and the director also got injured in the whole thing. I don't know. I think Alec Baldwin is just saying, I don't want it to be me, but I think it is you. But I think, it may be that they structured the case such that it will end up looking like they'll be able to say at the end that the jury declined to convict him, but that may be because they were hemmed in by being asked the question, well, is it really reasonable for an actor to believe that a gun, prop gun that he's been handed and told is just a prop gun, isn't a prop gun? And most people would probably say, no, that's not particularly reasonable. And so he'll walk for that reason. But unless there's a question of, well, what about the fact that, somebody made the decision to go ahead without the armorer on set, and that was you. Oh, well, I don't want it to be me. Yeah, well, it is. So I don't know. Also, I question the idea. I mean, it's not a bad conclusion to come to necessarily. It's not absolutely the wrong conclusion to come to say, well, I will never work on a production with guns involved again. I mean, well, for one thing, a lot of people probably wish you had come to that conclusion, well, before you shot somebody, one. But a long time ago, just in terms of, well, maybe we shouldn't have so much gun violence in our TV and movies. Okay. My approach to that, of course, is one of my pet things I think would make a great project. The sort of thing that you could grift off of if you were the right Hollywood type of person for a long time. And it would be great fun, and I'm sure you'd meet lots of Hollywood actors and actresses and have a great time mingling with them. But I live here, and I'm not into it. But my big thing is I always thought that we could cut down on the number of accidental shootings in the real world by people who say, I didn't know the gun was loaded. I thought it was unloaded. The opposite of what was actually happening. And I always thought that maybe we could do better in that category, particularly with the semi-automatic weapons, which when you put a magazine into a semi-automatic handgun, any semi-automatic weapon, and you rack that slide and chamber around and then take out the magazine, that one round is still in the chamber. And, people get fooled by not being actually trained in or exposed very much to semi-automatic weapons. I don't have any training with semi-automatic weapons. This is just something I've learned from, seeing this story over and over again, is that, then people will point it and pull the trigger, or point it at somebody and say, don't worry, it's not loaded. Haha, see, there's no magazine in it. And they pull the trigger and they just don't understand and or forgot that there could be around in the chamber. And I thought, there's actually an opportunity here for the TV and movie production industry. We've heard this story before, to teach people inadvertently, without them knowing that they're being taught, the mechanics of the semi-automatic weapon. Gunplay on screen is extraordinarily popular. People love it. They love the even without the shooting and the bang banging, the click clacking of things that go on when you're preparing guns or decommissioning weapons or taking them apart to clean them or unloading them for safety at the end of your, big Mission Impossible or whatever it is. There's lots of satisfying clicking and clacking that goes along on. And I think that if we put that on screen, if people who did productions where guns were included, if they made a commitment to showing where they were using semi-automatic weapons, and maybe even making a plot point of it to show that the guns are never fully unloaded and never safe unless both the magazine comes out and the slide gets racked again to eject the round that's in the chamber. And then you leave the chamber open and look in it and inspect it, or even stick a finger in there to make sure that there's no errant rounds that had been jammed in there before, even though you thought you cleared the chamber. You have to physically check it, eyeball it, stick a finger in there, make sure it's all clear before it's done. But there's lots of ritual that goes with it, and people would think that's cool gun stuff, and they would learn, when I have a semi-automatic weapon in my hand and I'm ready to put it down, I need to go through all of the cool stuff that my screen heroes do and do all the clicking and clacking and ejecting of rounds. People will love ejecting rounds all over the place, believe me. They're going to enjoy it. And they'll learn it without knowing that they're learning anything. My parallel is always people who have no training in the law whatsoever know that if they're arrested, that they have Miranda rights that they're entitled to, and somebody needs to warn them, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law if you cannot afford an attorney, all that sort of thing, right? And people know that just because it's cool stuff that happens in crime dramas, not because they are all attending law school at night. So, there's a responsibility, I think, that goes along with that sort of weaponry being displayed in a entertainment production, and you could do it really without damaging the entertainment value. In fact, you could enhance the entertainment value. This is the sort of thing that if I lived in LA, I could lobby for and lean on my good friends in the industry, of which I have none. But I would, because in LA, everybody has good friends in the industry. That just happens. It doesn't matter if you're working at the juice bar, right? So, you could lean on them for that, and then they would bring you and you would be testifying to legislatures about it, and you would be speaking to the Motion Picture Academy about, I don't know. And you'd be doing all those things and getting attention paid to the issue. And then you'd be consulting on sets, right? Being brought in and being paid $100,000 every time you have to go and tell people, what I just said over here, I'm just going to play you back the tape of what I said. And then you go, oh, and then you give me money. Apparently that's the way Hollywood works. I don't know exactly the mechanics of it, but it's something like that, as I understand it. Anyway, so that's news and odd, to say the least. All right, I have a couple of other stories. I didn't mean to spend that much time on this stuff, but let's see. I wanted to hop back to discussions we had yesterday about the debt ceiling issues and the minting of the coin. Lots of people talking about it, and lots of good support for it that's coming back out to the fore since the last time we heard about it, and lots of good criticism of the whole idea also resurfacing. There was something that Greg pointed me to yesterday, a Twitter thread, the bird site that nobody uses anymore. Well, Greg does, and this is how he found it, from Noah Rosenblum, and perhaps we can fill the few minutes before the break with that. He's an assistant professor. He's just an assistant professor, not an awesome, cool professor. I mean, pretty soon he will be. But you know what? It's pretty impressive to be an assistant professor at NYU Law regardless. And I hope I didn't hit a sore spot there or anything, like you passed over for tenure. I'm sure you'll get it now because of this awesome Twitter thread. And it goes like this. There is a lot of speculation about the governor's threat of a lawsuit. To switch topics, because I forgot what the topic of this tweet thread actually was. It was back with the Kathy Hochul thing and the judge. Remember where we left that yesterday? Okay, so forget about the platinum coin. Totally wrong. I was looking at everything else that I've got on it. But remember, we left it as saying, I think Hochul's people who are trying to force a lawsuit to say that the New York State Senate is obligated to hold a vote are dreaming. I think that it's wishful thinking. That's the way they wish the Constitution was interpreted, because they remember the Merrick Garland thing and they figured Democrats would be pro forcing the Senate to vote. But they're not. But Noah says there's lots of speculation about this threat of a lawsuit. First, I remain dubious she'll file, he said. That would escalate things dramatically by turning this into a fight over separation of powers and the prerogatives of the legislature instead of a conflict over a nominee. That's true. Second, because I think she'd lose the floor vote even if she got one. That's not entirely clear. But he says, I saw reports that enough Democrats had publicly come out against this judge that 6 more no's make this an absolute majority against. And I have heard that there are more than 6 private no's already. And, I haven't heard anything. I haven't done a whip count, so maybe he's right, but there's that's some weird margins to be playing with, and sounds like things are close. And if all the Republicans to screw with Democrats were to vote yes on this thing, you'd have some problems. Regardless, he says, the case is a non-starter. Nothing in the Constitution entitles any nominee to a floor vote, full stop. I certainly didn't see anything in there in my quick review. There is a lot in the Constitution about what the Senate is supposed to do, but I'm not sure any of it is directed to a court to enforce. In other words, it's probably non-justiciable, what they would call in the federal system a political case. Hi, everybody. It's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and Patreon.com, Patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, Patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. So we return to the question that is completely different from the question that I thought we were returning to. Not the platinum coin. That comes next, or later anyway. And we'll conclude with Noah Rosenblum's mini tweet thread here, Professor Rosenblum's tweet thread about the New York Constitution and the vote on this chief judge for the Court of Appeals. Remember the terminology there. But, he basically comes to the same conclusion. There's lots in the Constitution about what the Senate is supposed to do, but it doesn't look like there's anything in the Constitution or in practice in New York that would lead him to believe that courts are responsible for enforcing those jobs and making sure that the Senate does them. It would be a real separation of powers issue, or as I said, I was searching for the right terminology as we were leaving for the break. The courts in federal practice tend to reject cases like this as under the political question doctrine. Not that it's a political case. Everything's a political case. But the political questions doctrine, that is, in other words, that this is ultimately a question of how the Senate wants to operate and how it wants to make its own political decisions. And because it's, of course, a distinct branch of government, there are separation of powers issues with a court telling the legislature exactly what they can and can't do and how they must do it. And most states, if they model themselves on the federal constitution, of course, reserves to the legislature the right to make its own rules of procedure and decide how it's going to do things. And it would be very difficult under normal circumstances for a court to force its way in there. That's what he's saying. And then for that reason saying it's probably non-justiciable, the question of whether or not the governor can sue, can one branch use the other branch to sue the third branch there and force them to do something like that. That's a tough call. And then he winds up by saying, and that's without getting into the deep separation of powers questions, which is where I want to go with it. This is a political crisis, one of Hochul's making, but it's not a constitutional issue or one that a court can solve for her. So, yeah, that's pretty difficult. And then actually one of the first questions being posed here is, how does she overcome her presumable lack of standing? That's a good question, too. What standing does a governor have to sue the Senate over how they approach the question of handling a nominee? I guess you could make the argument, well, the governor has a clear interest here. The governor is the one making the nominations, but the governor has no personal or official interest in the seat itself. If anybody has an interest in it, it would be the judge who's nominated, I suppose. But I could see it, possibly getting past standing questions, but there are basically too many bedrock doctrines standing in the way of this thing actually happening. But hey, you never know. And I guess if you were having that fight in front of the United States Supreme Court and there was the opportunity to embarrass New York Democrats, who knows what sort of ruling they would come up with under those circumstances. So I suppose you should watch out for that, except this is happening in New York State courts. Okay. On the question of the coin. Okay, first of all, one of the things that I said yesterday, and I don't recall how integral it was, or even what the hell it was, but we were talking about the minting the platinum coin. Oh, yes, right. We were talking about it with Greg, and I said offhand, well, they could, I guess, mint it out of anything, but I suppose you want to mint it out of platinum because platinum is really cool and expensive and nice looking coinage wise. But that's not true. So or at least according to Wikipedia, which, generally has things right. I think the peer review process keeps things mostly on the up and up. And, so in passing, I will say that it turns out that the use of platinum would be quite deliberate here, and that the legal loophole that platinum coin, mint the coin people are seeking to exploit here, and there are a couple that work in tandem, but one of them is the ability to put any denomination on coinage if it's platinum. And that's the way it ends up working. I don't know if that's the way they designed it or that there was any particular reason for it. But apparently the mint is limited in the choice of denominations for ordinary coinage of other metals. But for platinum, they have the ability to put any amount on it. And I think the law was probably written with the idea in mind that, we don't know what they're going to want to do. If we imagine that $1, $5, $10, $20, $25 maybe, $50, $100, $1,000, these are denominations that you might put on any piece of currency and on any coin. And they felt comfortable limiting the minting of coins in those amounts, whatever circumscribed amounts that they had, for all other coins. But for platinum, they said, well, it could be any amount. And they probably were thinking, I don't know why, maybe for, just for the value of striking the things and selling them for collectors. Maybe they'll make a $2 coin. Maybe they'll decide there needs to be a $15 denomination. I don't know. Something like that. So they said, well, we'll leave it to your discretion, I guess. What's the difference? What's the difference to us here in Congress, whether you mint a $15 coin or a $2 coin or $11 coin? Who cares? And they probably didn't think, well, what if they just decide to mint a $1 trillion coin? Because why wouldn't they think about something like that? Well, nobody would do that. What would you be minting a $1 trillion coin for? Who would have a $1 trillion coin? Can't buy it as a collector. No one has $1 trillion. So, don't worry about it. It'll never happen. I don't know whether they had this idea in mind. Anyway, this information comes out of this section on this Wikipedia entry on the $1 trillion coin in particular. Has a short backgrounder and then explains the legal basis for all this stuff. I think the backgrounder, I think we're all pretty well versed in it, although I guess I didn't know this, that the concept of the $1 trillion coin was reintroduced in March of 2020 in the form of a congressional proposal by Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib during the shutdown caused by the COVID pandemic. I didn't realize that. I mean, I knew that the idea had come up earlier, and they mentioned all of that, but I didn't realize that Tlaib had revived it during COVID, saying that I guess she thought that it could be used to finance her proposed much broader program of support for people then isolating, and what was in the stage when everybody was like, we don't know when we're going to be able to get out of our houses and go back to work. Shouldn't we be sending everybody some money to live with while work isn't available? Anyway, the idea got further traction in late 2021 with propositions by Bloomberg journalist Joe Weisenthal, among others, amidst the United States debt ceiling crisis of 2021. And now, of course, the debt ceiling crisis of 2023 is upon us. And Greg was right. Apparently, we actually have hit our debt limit already. So this will help, I think, differentiate things in people's minds as between breaching the debt ceiling and defaulting on the debt. It is now that we've run out of statutory authority to borrow more money. It is in approximately June, with the use of enough extraordinary measures and accounting tricks, that we would be in trouble where we would say, all right, and we no longer have the cash around and we can't move money around in order to pay all our obligations anymore. So between now and June, no more borrowing, but no necessity, so to speak, for borrowing. It's a good idea to plan for the future by borrowing now, but no ability to do it, but no emergency per se until June, when the question of default on key obligations begins to become a reality. Anyway, so what's the legal basis? On what legal basis do they claim the ability to mint this coin? The issuance of paper currency, our article here says, is subject to various accounting and quantity restrictions that platinum coinage is not. According to the United States Mint, coinage is accounted for as follows. Ready? Since fiscal year 1996, the Mint has operated under the United States Mint Public Enterprise Fund, or PEF, as authorized by Public Law 10452, codified at 31 U.S. Code Section 5136. The PEF eliminates the need for appropriations. That is, for the act of minting coins over at the U.S. Mint. This is kind of interesting, and I guess this becomes an issue. If you started with the Constitution and said, show me in the Constitution where it says you can mint $1 trillion coin, what you'll find is that Congress has the power to mint coinage. And so you might say, well, if the Republicans control the House, there's no chance of a bill passing for ordering the mint to go ahead and mint the coin. So how will they do it? By what authority will they do it? And the answer is that this law, Public Law 10452 from 1996, the United States Mint Public Enterprise Fund, says that Congress delegates the responsibility to the mint going forward to make decisions about it, and we're handing that authority over to you. You don't have to ask us. You go ahead and mint the coins that you think need to be minted. Proceeds, but this is of course mostly for like collector's item coins. Proceeds from the sale of circulating coins to the Federal Reserve banks, or FRB for short, they go with that, bullion coins to authorized purchasers, and numismatic items, you'll have to look that one up, to the public and other customers are paid into the PEF. I think that's actually is for coin collectors. Anyway, when they mint those things, those special coins, or they sometimes mint, pure solid gold coins for people who want to, buy and invest in gold. And then they do contemplate very high denomination coinage for, token purposes, but for use as in circulation between the Federal Reserve banks and making payments to one another. Anyway, so that's all up to the mint now, according to 31 U.S. Code Section 5136. And so let's see. So where were we with this? Oh, right. All of this operations are left up to them, and all the funds raised from the sales are paid into the PEF, Public Enterprise Fund, and provide the funding for mint operations. All circulating bullion and numismatic operating expenses and capital investments incurred for the mint's operations and programs are paid for out of the PEF. So there's no action or authority that they need to wait for from the Congress anymore. That has all been handed over to them. By law, all funds in the PEF are available without fiscal year limitation. Revenues determined to be in excess of the amount required by the PEF are transferred to the United States Treasury General Fund as off-budget and on-budget receipts. I can't explain that part to you offhand, but off-budget receipts consist of seigniorage, the difference between the receipts from the Federal Reserve System from the sale of circulating coins at face value, and the full costs of minting and distributing circulating coins. Seigniorage, if I'm pronouncing that even anything close to how it's supposed to be said, SEIGNIORAG, is deposited periodically to the general fund, where it reduces the government's need to borrow. Now, that doesn't make a great deal of sense, but that's sort of an interesting little ending there. It reduces the government's need to borrow. They can make money off of the sale of coins, but the point is that the authority to make the decisions to offer a new line of coins for various reasons is up to the mint, and they have the independent authority to go ahead and do that. The concept of striking $1 trillion coin that would generate $1 trillion in seigniorage, and I wonder if there's a pronunciation guide here. And by the way, if you wanted to get a definition of that, the quick pop-up definition, if you hover over it, is there's one, they wanted you to know that there are varying spellings of seigniorage, but it's the difference between the value of money and the cost to produce and distribute it. In other words, if it costs 10 cents to make a quarter, right, the excess value, the 15 cents that comes from selling a quarter to somebody for 25 cents, of course, how do they pay you unless they already have quarters? But never mind all of that. You can pay by check. The excess is the seigniorage, and I guess that's essentially profit to the government. The government gets to pocket that money. So you have the authority to sell something for way more than it's worth, but that's normal, open market situation. But in order for the government to be able to do it and be on the up and up, there's a whole process for it. Anyway, the concept of striking $1 trillion coin that would generate $1 trillion in seigniorage, that's the idea, right? Which would be off budget or numismatic profit which would be on budget. Oh boy, and I should be now looking up. All right, I'm going to have to find out exactly what numismatic means too. Anyway, this would all be transferred to the Treasury, this extra profit. Anyway, it's all based on the authority granted by Section 31 of U.S. Code. It says Section 31. No, I guess what they really mean is 31 U.S. Code Section 5112 of the United States Code for the Treasury Department to mint and issue platinum bullion coins in any denominations that the Secretary of Treasury may choose. That's the wording of the law here. And again, these bullion coins, this is for like if you want to collect gold, invest in gold because everything else is going to hell, right? You can buy these beautiful gold eagle coins, They say they're worth $20, but you have to pay $400 for them because they've got lots of gold in them. But you're buying them for the gold content, not the face value. Well, you can do the same thing with platinum coins. And with platinum, for whatever reason, platinum has no limitation on the denominations. It's whatever the Secretary of the Treasury may choose. Thus, if the Treasury were to mint $1 trillion coins, it could deposit such coins at the Federal Reserve's Treasury account instead of issuing new debt. That's the theory. 31 U.S. Code Section 5112K, as originally acted by Public Law 104-208 in 1996, says the Secretary may mint and issue bullion and proof platinum coins in accordance with such specifications, designs, varieties, quantities, denominations, and inscriptions as the Secretary, in the Secretary's discretion, may prescribe from time to time. I don't know that they really meant for to be $1 trillion, but there it is. So any denomination you want. $1 trillion and 11 cents. Perfectly reasonable. I mean, perfectly legal anyway. And it could say, for instance, the inscription, instead of saying "In God We Trust," it could be "F everybody." If you wanted that to be the inscription, if the Secretary of the Treasury thought that that would help, they'd put it in there. I'd buy a coin that said that. I mean, I don't know if I have $1 trillion for you, but all right. Negative seigniorage, though. But I would want to have such a coin. All right. So would Kirsten Sinema, right? Doesn't she have a F off ring or something like that? Anyway, in 2000, the year 2000, that is, the word bullion was replaced with platinum bullion coins. So, really, it's just, there's the answer to why platinum. It has to be platinum because that's apparently the only coinage metal for which this much latitude has been afforded to the Secretary of the Treasury. Platinum coins can, by this statute, be minted in any denomination, whereas coins in any other specified metal are restricted to amounts of $50, $25, $10, $5, and $1. There you go. This is the origin of the concept of minting a very high denomination coin, since the platinum clause provides the only loophole. That is kind of interesting. All right. Well, there's a little bit more here to offer. Philip N. Deal, former director of the United States Mint, and with Republican Congressman Michael Castle, the author of the Platinum Coin Act, has said the procedure would be permitted by the statute. Castle said he never intended such a use. The platinum coinage provision was eventually passed by a Republican Congress over the objections of a Democratic Treasury in 1996. How do you like that? Lawrence Tribe, a constitutional law professor at Harvard Law School, said the legal basis of the $1 trillion coin is sound. I don't know. He says a lot of things are sound. And that the coin could not be challenged in court as no one would have the standing to do so. That may be true. All right. So there you go. There's another section here if you're really interested in it. Emergence of the concept, analysis and reaction, inflation risks, the independence of the Federal Reserve is addressed here. So it's a long and wordy article, but, might be, I don't know. If you want to spend your weekend on something like that, there's plenty in Wikipedia to get started with. And a lot of names that we recognize in here, by the way. And, well, let me say this is interesting here. An emergence of the concept right up at the beginning. I wasn't expecting this one. The idea for the Treasury Department to mint a coin and send it to the Federal Reserve to pay off the debt was first popularized by Populist Party presidential candidate Bo Gritz in 1992. And I remember this much. I think that his name is pronounced Gritz, even though it's spelled grits with a Z. And he was, like an arch conservative borderline, as I recall, was like a borderline white supremacist, white separatist kind of guy. And Joan probably could tell us all about him too, because didn't he base himself up there in like northern Idaho too? Anyway, so that's kind of interesting that this was an arch conservative thing, and that of course the law was written by Mike Castle, and that it was passed by a Republican Congress over the objections of a Democratic Treasury Secretary is kind of interesting as well. Maybe poetic justice that it should come back and disarm them in their debt ceiling brinkmanship game. Anyway, as a standard part of his stump speeches, he would hold up a 5-inch example coin. The specific concept was first introduced by Carlos Mucha, a lawyer who commented under the name Beowulf on various blogs. So that's really interesting too. Beowulf outlined the idea in a series of comments on Warren Mosler's blog in May of 2010, noting that Congress has already delegated to the Treasury all the seigniorage power authority it needs to mint a $1 trillion coin. That is very interesting. Also making an appearance in here, Brad DeLong, an economist blogger with whom we're probably all familiar, and Yale Law School's Jack Balkin, who also is a prolific blogger himself. Paul Krugman is in here. Lots of names jumping out at us in all of this. And it's, it's very interesting. And down here, by the way, at the end, it says, where does this sentence begin? He said, I don't know who said, but that he was inspired by the 2008 book Web of Debt by Ellen Brown, which quoted, and this may be Beowulf, which quoted a former Treasury official who said the government could order the printing of large coins to pay off the national debt. Beowulf said the $1 trillion coin idea is more rightly attributed to a small discussion group than to an individual, adding that the group was just in it for the lulz. So it's kind of interesting, I must say. And although I wasn't just in it for the lulz, it does remind me a little bit of, launching an idea like this into the public sphere. It's a rare thing for the blogosphere to be able to have done. But I would, put that up against the nuclear option and Senate rules changes and filibuster reform in terms of strange things that have been distilled out of the blogs that somehow made it to almost the level of reality. So that's really kind of interesting. Let's see. Other things on the same subject that I still felt there was room for discussion on our commentary on, I believe on this subject, and now I have to double check to go back, but Bruce McFarlane, who listens to the show and comments quite frequently, had some things to add about it. One, at least tongue-in-cheek here, that the coin should have Biden's good friend, iconic Republican iconoclast and war hero John McCain on it, primarily so that we can say that killing the debt ceiling is good news for John McCain, but secondarily to annoy Trump and MAGA. And I'm in agreement there. That might actually work. It certainly would work to annoy them. I have no doubt about that. I kind of love the meme value of being able to say it's good news for John McCain. What else? Yes, he also was commenting on the idea of value-added taxes and the so-called Fair Tax Act, the 30% sales tax that they were proposing, some Republican. Let's see, he's commenting on our Wednesday show saying, my description of how a simple sales tax compounds is why Europe and Australia use value-added taxes. The seller submits the difference between the VAT, that is the value-added tax they received, and the value-added tax they paid, and of course paperwork documenting how much value-added tax was collected and paid, and at each stage is part of the game here. And the Australians call it a goods and services tax to focus on the fact that if it was just a sales tax on goods, it would have to be much higher than 30% in order to raise the same amount of money. For example, the 2021 domestic consumption of goods was just $5.5 trillion, whereas consumption of services was $10.4 trillion. Probably something that the Republican proponents of the sales tax forget, because I'm sure that their act in the end would almost certainly have a huge number of exemptions, i.e. the transactions that Republicans and aspiring rich people think that they'll be engaging in that shouldn't be subject to taxation. But all transactions need to be subject to transaction taxes in order for a scheme like this to work. Anyway, so for a real fair tax to work, as Bruce points out, would be a tax on goods and services, including financial services, with the government then having to be told about every substantial transaction at every step of the production process. And as he says here, boy, independent voters will love this system, said nobody with any sense, right? The Republican proposal here is that every dollar that enters Donald Trump's hands and leaves Donald Trump's hands must be accounted for and taxed without exception, and hiding anything, any transaction of any kind from government tax authorities is tax evasion and punishable presumably by fines and prison. And so that's everything that they say they oppose about the IRS. But you would need a far more robust bureaucracy monitoring all of this than you have currently at the IRS now, even if you do, in fact, go ahead with hiring more auditors and officers to watch things that we under the system we have now. It would be much more intrusive, and they just don't seem to be acknowledging that. Although maybe what we're not acknowledging is they intend to write a lot of loopholes for themselves. Maybe not in the initial bill, but later on. So, okay. All right. Coming up on our second break here, I guess I'll throw in one other short story, just jumping to a completely different topic, but reading from Crooks and Liars here. Susie Madrick covering this story of Congressman Greg Steube. I don't know how he pronounces that last name. I haven't really run into this guy, but it's either Stube or Steube, Steube. And this is just a side note here for Kevin McCarthy and his super narrow majority. And I think she commented on one of the social media platforms where she circulated the story. Maybe he wants to think twice about that proxy voting rule again. Congressman Steube is absent, having suffered an accident falling off of his roof somehow. I don't know. Maybe he was fiddling up there. I have no idea what he was doing. But, they'll need his vote. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Yeah, well, we ran up against the break a little sooner than I thought. But, by the way, as it turns out, one of the platforms on which Susie Madrick made the comment that Kevin McCarthy might just start worrying about getting rid of the proxy voting was the article itself. It happens to be the first line in the article. I think it also went along with the tweet or toot or whatever it was that I saw accompanying the article. But yes, point there being extraordinarily mundane and dumb stuff could have significant policy impact. If you are working with a 4-seat or whatever, or something even smaller majority in the House, and some significant number of them are constantly angry with the leadership for various reasons, either because they have genuine grievances or because they want to be the leadership and they're not, and so they're upset. Whatever it is, they have no margin for error. And when somebody falls off their roof, and if they don't, show up in Washington to cast their vote, you might have to start pulling legislation from the floor or revamping legislation and changing legislation in order to make up for the loss of your one guy who was going to put you over the top because he fell off the roof. So there's lots to know about Congressman Stubbe here. And of course, the reason we'll be reading it from Crooks and Liars as opposed to anyone else is because they'll tell you the stuff that other newspapers will leave out. He is a pillar of his community, and he fell off his roof, and it's a tragedy, and Kevin McCarthy is worried, yada, yada, yada. You get all that from, local papers or Reuters. But the other stuff about why you don't have to feel particularly sad that a guy fell off his roof and got hurt, that's all here thanks to Crooks and Liars. All right. Yesterday, Florida Congress critter Greg Stubbe fell off his roof and is in the hospital, which leaves Kevin with a 2-vote margin. His caucus might start to get mansion and cinema type ideas. I don't know if they're up for that sort of thing. Embedded here, let's see, there's the news report about it. Here are some tweets about it. Southpaw tweeting about it, saying the Sarasota Republican was reportedly doing routine home maintenance and apparently fell from his roof about 25 feet to the ground. Sounds rough. His landing not padded by the outrageous suits in which he is photographed here in the embedded tweets here. I guess he's got a thing about dressing with distinction, maybe. Anyway, Congressman Stubbe, here's a quote from something, I don't know. Congressman Stubbe was involved in an accident on his property late this afternoon and has sustained several injuries. We will provide additional updates when possible. Please pray for the congressman and his family, Stubbe's office said in a statement on Twitter. Thoughts and prayers, Greg. All right, there you go. What else is another tweet here embedded from Christian Ziegler, who says, I just heard that even though Congressman Greg Stubbe is still in the hospital, he's doing well. Big relief to hear our country and state and local community needs him to recover and get back to fighting for us in Congress ASAP. Anyway, Stubbe is your basic Florida issue MAGA, as she says, MAGA with the T on the end, MAGA, right? He's a member of the Freedom Caucus, and the Republican Can't Study Committee. He supports the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, which is no doubt making his hospital bills much more affordable, but never mind. He signed on to oppose the certification of Joe Biden's election. He voted by proxy on several issues, citing the pandemic, but he was really off enjoying himself at CPAC. So, he's kind of that sort of person. Somebody else tweeting, Greg Stubbe is an insurrectionist. He signed the Texas amicus brief. He objected to certification of electoral college votes. He made false and irresponsible statements against the democratic system. He voted against impeachment of Trump for inciting an insurrection, et cetera, et cetera. So, in conclusion, Susie adds here, he also voted against giving the Congressional Gold Medal to the police officers who defended the Capitol. I will give him exactly the same amount of caring and compassion he has given his fellow humans, which is to say, not much at all. And I'm sympathetic with that view of things. Anyway, just thought I would update you on that and remind you that, again, dumb stuff. Catching a cold and actually not going to work because you don't feel well and you want to keep other people safe, which is not necessarily, ordinary Republican behavior. But, being ill, falling off a roof, missing your flight, anything. When you're talking about margins that they've got in the House, it means, you'll have to legislate around these sorts of things. And that's something to be kept in mind. All right. Let's see. Other things to share with you today. I have, why not this one? I thought this was an intriguing sounding entry from Washington Monthly magazine. This one written up by Peter M. Shane, he'd like you to know, apparently. And this is a topic that we really need to pay some attention to. Jim Jordan's reckless new committee. The MAGA congressman chairs the new House Committee on, in addition to the House and the Committee on the Judiciary, he's going to chair the subcommittee, I guess, on the weaponization of the federal government. Remember that one? And is vowing to use it to probe open federal investigations. That's the issue here. And a good one and well worth pointing out. The creation of a House Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government, and they're going with that as the name, portends an all too predictable and largely unproductive cycle of interbranch friction. The name itself betrays that the panel has already concluded that the executive branch misused its resources. That's true. It's a good point. And in that sense, very much like, for instance, the executive orders issued here in Virginia by Glenn Youngkin on day one of his governorship, saying that Loudoun County shall appoint a special prosecutor to look into the lying and wrongdoing of school officials here, which I understand it's everybody's feeling that was the case. But to start a special prosecution with that as your marching orders, well, how do you think that investigation is going to come out? Anyway, so back to the article on the weaponization of the federal government subcommittee. It will start with overheated demands for information. Of course, that's what they're going to do. They intend to use this to subpoena information from the Justice Department. Of course, the main point of this article is they'll be subpoenaing information about ongoing open investigations, to which the standard DOJ response always is, it is our policy not to comment on or share information about ongoing investigations, which will lead immediately to the committee then saying, all right, well, then we'll subpoena the information. And they'll say, no, you can't have that information. We can't give that to you. It will destroy our investigation. And then it'll be a fight over, remember just last year where everybody in the newspaper world agreed that you had to honor congressional subpoenas? Well, you have to honor this one. See, what a bunch of hypocrites. Of course, these will be subpoenas issued by people who ignored their subpoenas when they were the targets. But never mind all of that. There's a bigger issue at stake. So, as we said, it will start with overheated demands for information. The committee's chair, Representative Jim Jordan, has said the wide-ranging probe would include the FBI raid on Mar-a-Lago for documents that Donald Trump failed to return to federal authorities, the Department of Homeland Security probe of disinformation on social media, and the origins of the investigation by the FBI and other federal agencies into contacts between the Russian Federation and the Trump campaign in 2016. The Biden administration will comply with some requests while resisting others. Republicans will denounce recalcitrance as a cover-up. Fox News, for its part, will condemn any lack of transparency as Democratic hypocrisy. Democrats, in turn, will remind Americans that Jordan refused to speak to the January 6th committee. This would not be the first time that politically motivated congressional investigations have sought to tarnish the records of federal law enforcement and counterintelligence agencies. GOP leaders have portrayed their new committee as if it were an honorable successor to the Church Committee in the U.S. Senate. And that'll be riling Joan quite a bit too, I know, which revealed abusive investigations by the FBI, CIA, and NSA of civil rights and anti-war activists. In its motivation and tendentiousness, however, Jordan's committee seems more to resemble Senator Joseph McCarthy's infamous investigations in the early 1950s or the earlier pernicious activities of the House Un-American Activities Committee. The new committee's authorization to examine, quote, ongoing criminal investigations provokes concern from the get-go. Protecting open investigations has been the responsibility of both Democratic and Republican administrations. Charles Cooper, a prominent conservative attorney, made it clear in 1986, when he was the head of the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel during the Reagan administration, that open investigations need to be safeguarded. He wrote, "This policy, with respect to executive branch investigations, was first expressed by President Washington and has been reaffirmed by or on behalf of most of our presidents, including Presidents Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and Eisenhower." I guess those are just popular guys who did it. I don't know. I mean, it's been pretty much everybody. No president, to our knowledge, has departed from this position, affirming the confidentiality and privileged nature of open law enforcement files. An earlier Reagan-era OLC opinion cataloged half a dozen distinct reasons for the Justice Department's protectiveness. It asserted that the deliberations among lawyers and investigators might be less effective and candid if confidentiality cannot be preserved. Sharing open files could result in leaks of information that the government has amassed, along with damaging revelations of investigative sources and methods. This latter point would be of special concern should the safety of confidential informants be involved, and information sharing might chill other whistleblowers from coming forward. The Justice Department is also worried about the privacy of innocent individuals who may be identified in law enforcement files but who may not be guilty of any violation of law, and Congress might well try to exert political influence over the course of an investigation if the Justice Department were to share with Congress open law enforcement files. Whether or not Congress applied such pressure successfully, prosecutors would be justly apprehensive that the perception of the integrity, impartiality, and fairness of the law enforcement process as a whole will be damaged if sensitive material is distributed beyond those persons necessarily involved in the investigation and prosecution process. Lawyers for later administrations embraced the same reasoning, including the Clinton administration's Justice Department and White House lawyers for the George W. Bush administration, who weren't always, great people. Anyway, the presumption in favor of shielding ongoing investigations can sometimes be overcome. In 1982, hold on a second here. You see what we're getting to here? All right, we'll get it. Well, let's read it here first. In 1982, when Congress was investigating potentially criminal misconduct at the EPA, Attorney General William French Smith assured an aggressive oversight chairman, Representative John Dingell, many of you will remember him, the principles supporting confidentiality will not be employed to shield documents which contain evidence of criminal or unethical conduct from proper view. And indeed, as Congress developed evidence of Superfund mismanagement under Rita Lavelle, then chief of the EPA's toxic waste program, the White House released all the investigative files to which Dingell had demanded access. But by the way, I just wanted to remind everybody why I was smiling and chuckling at this. The 1982 era fights with between the Oversight Committee and the EPA also involved the first modern era open defiance of subpoenas by executive branch officials that had been issued by congressional committees. And the big test case, I don't think that ever actually made it through the courts, but the big test case that threatened to land in the courts was the subpoena of Ann Gorsuch, who was the administrator of the EPA. Again, a big test case that threatened to land in the Supreme Court's lap over whether executive privilege would be the immovable object as against the irresistible force of a congressional subpoena, and where would that land as between, the powers as between the two branches, and whether the third branch could intervene to pick a winner between the two, and they decided that they could not, pretty much. And this was, a reinforcement of the political question doctrine. But of course, the more interesting angle on all of that is that Ann Gorsuch is Neil Gorsuch's mother. And he probably grew up hearing around the dinner table what a horrible thing it was for the judicial branch to contemplate intervening in order to allow the legislative branch to force executive branch officials to actually testify or punish them if they didn't. Anyway, for now, however, Fox News talking points and Freedom Caucus fulminations do not go further than having what the Washington Post's Ruth Marcus has generously called a tangential basis. In fact, unless Jordan's committee can do better, the Justice Department ought to follow the precedent set by earlier administrations and refuse to share open law enforcement files with an overreaching and political probe. Anyway, so yes, essentially here the idea being illustrated in all of this is, he actually didn't address it directly to this point for much of the article. But of course, one of the things that can happen when you share open investigation files with a congressional committee or anybody outside of the investigation itself is it ends up tainting the investigation. Information leaks, the names of informants leak, the sources and methods used leak and become stale and can no longer be used to gather good information. But also it taints the public record and public knowledge of the situation such that it might become impossible in the end to grant a fair trial to people who are in fact under investigation and should stand, should face federal charges. But it becomes very difficult to either to conduct a trial fairly or to draw an unbiased jury pool, whatever it might be, if all of this information leaks out in drips and drabs and becomes part of the public, what the public thinks is its understanding of the case before they even begin any trial. And I think that's the worry here, is that might be the aim, because so many of the people serving on this committee, including its chairman, would have a vested interest in spoiling federal investigations, because they are in some cases the target of these federal investigations, sometimes the direct target, sometimes a tangential target. And to the extent that you can say, well, we were just doing our job overseeing the government to make sure that it didn't get weaponized against anybody at all, not one or two people in particular. But as it happens, the federal cases that we happen to ruin were the ones pending against ourselves. What a strange coincidence that would be. And, of course, that's the whole idea. As Hakeem Jeffries has called it, it's the Insurrection Protection Committee. That's all it really is about, is using subpoena power to leverage and ruin the work of the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, and others who are actually investigating all of those things. The Pervalago case, the January 6th cases, the Trump-Russia cases, on and on. So, okay, let's see. That's rather depressing, but needed to be shared. Other, I guess, stories along that line are, one here that my brother Mark sent this morning, which we have to take a look at, about John Eastman, who is, according to the headline here, unbowed as investigations proliferate. Maybe he's unbowed because somewhere the combination of the possibility of future Donald Trump pardons, the repercussions of previous Donald Trump pardons, and, of course, the existence of committees like this committee to investigate the investigators, essentially, now has his back. They've now got a special select subcommittee that will be dedicated to trying to undermine the case against people like John Eastman, so no wonder he's unbowed. The subheader here says, a legal reckoning awaits a chief architect of Donald Trump's efforts to reverse his election loss, but in Mr. Eastman's telling, he was far from a criminal. And lots of people were a little upset, as I recall, with that subheader. I guess it might be repeated in the body of the article, the idea of a legal reckoning awaits. Because apparently the writers of the article, and here it's credited to Danny Hakim and Michael Schmidt, prominent New York Times columnists and or reporters, but apparently one of the points gets made in here is that Eastman's discussion of his role in January 6th is at times contradictory, even in terms of as between what he's told Danny Hakim and Michael Schmidt in the past. He now says different things, and that their view of it is, well, there'll be a legal reckoning, as opposed to, well, obviously he lied. One of the two times he had to have been lying, but at any rate, let's read through the article and see what we think. John C. Eastman, a legal architect of Donald J. Trump's efforts to overturn his 2020 election loss, invoked his Fifth Amendment rights more than 100 times under questioning by the House January 6th committee. But in recently released testimony from the committee's investigation, other witnesses had plenty to say about him. Many White House lawyers expressed contempt for Mr. Eastman, portraying him as an academic with little grasp of the real world. Greg Jacob, The legal counsel to former Vice President Mike Pence characterized Mr. Eastman's legal advice as gravely, gravely irresponsible, calling him the serpent in the ear of Mr. Trump. Yikes. Eric Hirschman, the Trump White House lawyer, also recounted chewing out Mr. Eastman. Patsy Maloney, our good friend, the chief White House counsel, also described calling Eastman's ideas nutty. So that's not great for Eastman. Anyway, in the coming months, Eastman will be facing a legal reckoning. He has been drawn into the criminal investigation into election interference in Atlanta, which is nearing a decision on potential indictments. The FBI seized his iPhone, and the January 6th committee, in one of its last acts, asked the Justice Department to investigate Mr. Eastman on a range of criminal charges, including obstructing a congressional proceeding. For good measure, he faces a disciplinary bar proceeding in California. A once obscure scholar at the right-wing Claremont Institute, Mr. Eastman joined the Trump camp shortly after the election and was soon among a group of lawyers who, with the president's blessing, largely commandeered decision-making from lawyers at the White House and on the Trump campaign. He championed a two-pronged strategy that the January 6th committee portrayed as a coup plot. The first was enlisting party officials to organize slates of bogus electors in swing states where Mr. Trump lost, even after the results had been certified and recertified, as in Georgia. The second was pressuring Mr. Pence to deviate from the vice president's traditionally ceremonial role and decline to certify all the electoral votes on January 6th. While Mr. Eastman refused to answer most of the committee's questions, he has hardly been at a loss for words. At the Stop the Steal rally on January 6th, held on the Ellipse moments before Trump supporters marched toward the Capitol, he spoke ominously of stolen elections, voting machinery chicanery, and ballots stuffed in a secret folder. Over the last 2 years, he has remained defiant in a string of public appearances and interviews and painted a picture sharply at odds with other accounts, most notably those of Mr. Pence and two of his aides who cooperated with the House committee. In Mr. Eastman's telling of the lead-up to the January 6th attack, he was far from a criminal. In fact, in a recent interview, a fuller version of one he gave to the New York Times in the fall of 2021, he says he was helping to head off a potentially more perilous outcome. He claims that in an Oval Office meeting on January 4th, he helped convince Mr. Trump that Mr. Pence did not have the power to pick whomever he wanted as president, and Mr. Eastman said his advice to the president and vice president was only that Mr. Pence should pause the certification of the election, giving legislatures more time to consider fraud allegations in certain states where Mr. Trump had lost. I think my greatest contribution to this conversation is to have backed Trump away from the notion that Pence could simply gavel him as reelected, Mr. Eastman said during the interview at his lawyer's office in Washington, just blocks from the White House. And you look at some of his tweets before that January 4th meeting, and he's saying things like that because that's what people out there are saying. But if you look at his speech on January 6th, after I weigh in at the meeting, he's saying exactly the opposite. Few in the White House, however, saw him as anything close to a voice of moderation amid the riot that followed, and Mr. Eastman's account differs in significant ways from those provided by Mr. Pence and his aides. The former vice president refused to cooperate with the January 6th committee, but addressed the issue in a recent opinion essay in the Wall Street Journal. Mr. Pence wrote that on January 5th, a day after first meeting with Mr. Eastman in the Oval Office, Mr. Trump summoned the vice president for another meeting where the president's lawyers, including Mr. Eastman, were now requesting that I simply reject the electors. He said that he later learned that Mr. Eastman had conceded to my general counsel that rejecting electoral votes was a bad idea, and any attempt to do so would be quickly overturned by a unanimous Supreme Court. This guy didn't even believe what he was telling the president. The crux of Mr. Eastman's defense is that he was simply a lawyer offering advice and that he was acting in good faith since he still believes many of the fraud claims that were made. I'm not backing down on that, he said. I mean, the amount of evidence, even if I'm wrong about it, was certainly enough to have warranted further review. Asked what he based such claims on, he cited a report issued last year by Michael J. Gableman. Remember him? A former Wisconsin judge who was hired and later fired by the Republican Speaker of the Wisconsin State Assembly, Robin Vos. The report endorsed a host of debunked claims. He also cited the deeply flawed documentary, and I should really put the quotes around the word documentary, 2,000 Mules, directed by Dinesh D'Souza, a conservative activist who once pleaded guilty to felony campaign finance fraud, but of course was later pardoned by Mr. Trump. In recent weeks, Mr. Eastman has continued to assert himself as a far-right stalwart, signing a letter endorsing dissident Republicans' ultimately failed efforts to block Representative Kevin McCarthy of California from becoming Speaker of the House. Among the other signatories to the letter was Virginia Thomas, the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who is more than pleased, I'm sure, today to find herself not being pointed to as the source of the leak of the Dobbs case. Apparently they've decided they can't figure that one out there at the Supreme Court. Well, anyway, she also a signer of that letter. And let's see, for whom Eastman once clerked, that is to say, Clarence Thomas. Okay, right. In her own testimony to the January 6th committee, Mrs. Thomas, or Ms. Thomas it says here, referred to Mr. Eastman as an active participant with the Thomas Clique clerks who kept in touch. Well, of course he was.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson, the guy that writes the daily summary for this show, Kagro in the Morning. Thank you to everyone that supports this show. Many of you send donations through PayPal, Patreon, Square Cash, Radio Public, and so on. Some of you write your own essays and send them in, or read articles with your own commentary. We appreciate it. Now, some of you are listening to this and thinking, I'd like to help, but isn't there something I could do that wouldn't require money or effort? Why, yes, there is. You can just like us. On Daily Kos, they call it the recommend button. YouTube has a thumbs up. There are hearts and likes and love buttons. Tap our love button. Tap our love button every day. Share our shows and summaries on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and iTunes, Stitcher and Amazon. Most of these places allow you to write a review, so a sentence or two would be great. Recommend us to social media, or tell your friends to listen to the show. You aren't just helping us, you're helping them find their new favorite thing to listen to. You could change the world. So thank you in advance from me and everybody else in the world.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's finish up with this Eastman article here. We left off right at the end of this paragraph here. So next up, perhaps Mr. Eastman's most immediate potential exposure comes in the criminal investigation into election interference in Fulton County, Georgia, which encompasses most of Atlanta. One of Mr. Eastman's lawyers said last year that his client was probably a target in the inquiry, but his lawyers said this month that he had received no notification that he is one. Robert Sinners, that's what it looks like, Sinners, the Trump campaign's state director of election day operations in Georgia, testified to the January 6th committee that he later felt, quote, ashamed at having taken part in the plan orchestrated by Eastman and Rudy Giuliani, Trump's personal lawyer, to assemble bogus slates of Trump electors in Georgia and other states that Trump had lost. I don't think Rudy Giuliani's intent was ever about legal challenges, he said. It was clear to me that he was working with folks like John Eastman and wanted to put pressure on the vice president to accept these slates of electors just regardless, without any approval from a governor, without any approval from, the voters or a court or anything like that. Clark D. Cunningham, a professor at Georgia State University College of Law, said in an email that if Sinners' testimony or similar testimony is deemed credible, then John Eastman faces considerable risk of prosecution. If Eastman was part of a conspiracy to trick Georgia citizens into signing false election documents, neither his role as an attorney nor as a personal belief that election results were tainted by fraud could justify such criminal conduct, he added. Maybe. We'll see. In addition to his central role in the electors plan, Mr. Eastman appeared remotely before a Georgia State Senate panel on December 3rd, 2020, and made several false claims about the election. Among them was the assertion that, quote, the number of underage individuals who are allowed to register in the state amounts allegedly up to approximately 66,000 people. Asked about the claim during the interview last month, Mr. Eastman said that he had relied on a consultant who made an error that was later corrected, and the actual number was around 2,000, who, quote, were only 16 when they registered. The new figure, he said, came from the same consultant. In a statement, the Georgia Secretary of State's office said that the system literally does not allow a person to register if they don't have a birth date that makes them at least 17 and a half years old. A review of the data used by Mr. Eastman showed that he was referring to any Georgians who were recorded as having registered early, going back to the 1920s. Data entry errors appeared to be the common culprit, with many people's registration year listed in place of their birth year. A review by the Times found that only about a dozen Georgians who were recorded as having registered in 2020 when they were 16 in what appeared most likely to be another data entry problem. Norman Eisen, special counsel to the House Judiciary Committee during the first Trump impeachment and co-author of a lengthy report on the Fulton County inquiry, said Mr. Eastman, quote, was referred for criminal prosecution by the January 6th committee with good reason, adding that if charges are brought in Georgia, it's hard to imagine that DA Fani Willis does not include him. And I guess that brings us to the end of the article, the rest of it being supplemental links to other reporting on the subject. But apparently the record is replete with admissions that Eastman is up to far more nefarious pursuits than previously reported. And just the idea that it's the impression of others there, as we found out in the Georgia case here, that they just basically said, well, we're just going to put these slates of electors together, and we can't even fake a legal basis for them anymore. We're just saying you should just use these names instead. That's a pretty bald-faced coup attempt, and there's very little other way of describing it that would be accurate. All right, other things that I wanted to share. Let's see, I have what I hope will be a useful entry from Amanda Marcotte, writing in Salon about the New Mexico shooting suspect. An intriguing, headline: New Mexico shooting suspect shows Republicans seek a violent solution to rejection. This is an interesting spin on things. From the big lie to Twitter to their families, Republicans refuse to peacefully admit that they're unpopular. I wonder if this has any bearing on the incel problem as well. News coverage of failed GOP candidate Solomon Peña's arrest for allegedly orchestrating a plot to shoot up the homes of various elected Democrats, which he in fact did execute that plan and in fact fired some of those rounds himself, has consistently highlighted one key detail: his claim to be the real winner of the race for New Mexico House District 14 are so ridiculous that it's hard not to laugh. Ever since Donald Trump's big lie about the 2020 election, there's been an assumption that election denialists would at least try to make their claims a little plausible by only crying fraud in relatively close elections. Failed Republican Arizona gubernatorial candidate Kari Lake, for instance, continues to proclaim herself the real winner of an election that she lost last cycle by less than a percentage point. Peña, on the other hand, lost his bid for the New Mexico House of Representatives in a deep blue city, Albuquerque, to Democrat Miguel Garcia by over 47 percentage points, garnering only 26.4% of the vote. Prior to allegedly paying people to drive stolen cars to shoot at the homes of 4 Democratic officials, Peña was reported harassing various officials and insisting that he was the real winner of the race. Chilling video from the doorbell camera of former Bernalillo County Commissioner Debbie O'Malley, whose home was later a target of an attempted shooting. Well, it's an actual shooting, but they were attempting to shoot the people inside. That they didn't affect, but shooting the house, they did. Anyway, that video shows an agitated Pena at her door demanding a conversation about his delusions. And here is the embedded video here in a tweet for you to check out if you're interested. The standard take on this is indisputable. This is the natural outcome of Trump's big lie. What we're seeing now are the results of the way that Donald Trump opened the door. Lindsay Schubner, programs director at the Western States Center, told Vox. The conspiracy theories that led to January 6th are ongoing, and so, therefore, is the political violence they inspire. But in another sense, the root cause of such political violence runs even deeper than that. Pena's alleged plot is the latest manifestation of a deeper and expanding malady affecting Republicans nationwide. A refusal to accept that their political views are simply unpopular. When faced with proof that they and their ideas are being rejected, rather than reform or at least try to recast their ideas, Republicans often turn to conspiracy theories about sinister forces working against them. In the right-wing imagination, the problem could never be that people have heard their ideas and decided that they just don't like them. Blame is instead put on woke educators or Hollywood manipulators brainwashing the masses. The deep state, meanwhile, supposedly steals elections, and the globalists, red Jews, of course, somehow pull all the strings. This week, Caitlin Tiffany at The Atlantic reported on one of the funnier headaches Tesla CEO Elon Musk invited into his life by buying Twitter to cater to right-wingers. Conservative users who insist dark forces are suppressing their God-given right to more followers, way more followers. So prior to Musk's takeover, conservatives routinely insisted that their failure to see tweets go viral must be due to shadow banning, a mostly imaginary practice of social media companies reducing a tweet's weight in an algorithm to hide a toxic viewpoint. Musk promised he'd stop the shadow banning, which, easy enough, since it's not a real thing. But of course, conservative Twitter users are still claiming their low engagement rates must be due to these alleged shadow bans. Tiffany writes, Musk recently added view counts to the bottom of tweets, presumably with the intention of equipping users with data and giving them greater insight into whether others are actually seeing their tweets and just not liking them. This effort appeared to mostly anger people. The numbers were smaller than expected, which served as more evidence of shadow banning. What else are they going to do? Admit that most people just don't like them? They're no more going to admit that than Trump admits that he lost the 2020 election. Instead, a conspiracy theory is plugged in to explain how unpopular right-wing accounts are actually beloved by the masses. Watching Twitter users like Cat Turd whine that they'd be getting more retweets but for the shadow ban is funny. Less so is this article from the New York Post, linked here, about reactionary parents who are estranged from their children and have chosen to blame woke brainwashing instead of their own bad choices. The Post, being a right-wing rag, is totally credulous in the face of stories of parents who want to hire deprogrammers to fix their supposedly brainwashed kids. It's actually quite disturbing as a prospect right there. Like, if you're, it's the old, lunatics running the asylum problem, right? If you've actually fallen prey to the MAGA cult, and that teaches you that the reason people don't like you isn't that you're a part of the MAGA cult, but rather that they're part of the brainwashed woke cult, and you hire deprogrammers to, presumably, kidnap and brainwash or attempt to brainwash your supposedly woke kids because you're in fact enthralled to the MAGA cult. I don't even know how to unwind that. Wow. Anyway, back to Amanda's writing here. I've had fights with some of my girls just because I wouldn't get myself a Rainbow Pride Starbucks cup. One woman, who unconvincingly claims to be, quote, a Democrat and a liberal, told the Post. One child hasn't spoken to her in 4 years and the other in a year, which she chalks up to not to anything she's done, but to the kids being, quote, politically correct. Another woman claims that her daughter abandoned her because, quote, we're conservatives and that we should all be against men. If you're skeptical that you're getting the full story from these women, you should be. Their children were not interviewed. The Post says they reached out to 2 but got no response, which is likely not a sign of woke brainwashing, but frustration with an overbearing mother who sicked a Rupert Murdoch-owned organization against them. But both women tacitly admit that their daughters are lesbians, while insisting homophobia is not at the center of the fight, leaving one to suspect that the fight over a Starbucks cup was not actually over a Starbucks cup. Indeed, the article glowingly quotes self-proclaimed deprogrammer Ted Patrick. You've got to get these kids alone. I've snatched people from Yale. What? Why would you say such a thing? Unmentioned in the article is that another word for snatching is kidnapping, or that Patrick and his clients have a long history of legal battles stemming from taking adults against their will to, quote, cure them of behaviors like being in a same-sex relationship or joining more liberal churches than their parents liked. He's done time in prison for this crime. Wow. So that's fairly serious here. Now some embedded clips from Twitter here. One person commenting on the New York Post story here, saying this trend of kidnapping adult children and deprogramming them, which in this context means the opposite, that they will brainwash those individuals back to what their parents believe. They use the kinds of tactics of cults and conversion therapies is extremely abusive. And wow, that is pretty disturbing and upside down. Talk about your gaslighting. Anyway, tempting as it is to write these 2 off as truly deluded outliers, the truth is the New York Post ran this article because they thought a lot of readers would see sympathetic victims of wokeness, where the rest of us see narcissistic bullies. It goes to show that while Pena took it to a near deadly level, the same basic premise he was working under is widespread on the right. Conservatives increasingly feel emboldened to tell themselves that it's impossible that they or their ideas could be honestly rejected. Instead, they react to the word no like a stalker ex-boyfriend as permission to use coercive tactics. I'm surprised we haven't gotten into the incel problem here yet. Maybe that's her next article. People who refuse to take no for an answer have always been a problem, of course. But in the era of Trump, that toxic behavior is being validated and mainstreamed as the standard Republican practice. Trump's narcissism is no longer just his individual psychological damage, but the systematic structure of the GOP. And I think that's largely true. It's now Republican canon that they admire the ones who, in the face of, all evidence to the contrary, simply won't take no for an answer and are strong and standing up for what they believe when they say, no, the law doesn't apply to me. No, I don't have to do these things. No, I didn't lose this election. No, it's not wrong for me to shoot you or your house. No, it's not wrong for me to go on an incel rampage with an AR-15. It's right. You bitches are screwing everything up with your feminism. I'm correct. How could anybody disagree with me? It's all because you've been, woke brainwashed. You have woke brain virus, as Elon Musk joins in saying these days, out loud. Anyway, let me continue with Amanda's writing here. It's a soothing myth, of course, to believe that your failures to persuade others are not on you, but the fault of shadowy conspiracies. But the danger is that such a belief ends up, as the frightening deprogramming rhetoric shows, justifying the use of force where persuasion fails. Because of this, Pena's alleged crimes cannot be dismissed as outlier violence. He is simply the logical conclusion of the increasingly standard Republican view that conservatism can never fail, but can only be failed. That's the end of the article. Like I said, I'm actually surprised that she didn't use it to expand into the incel mindset. And remember, that's kind of exactly what they're saying, right? The incel, of course, stands for involuntarily celibate. And their whole premise is that feminism is a woke brain virus or a woke cult convincing the women through nefarious means not to have sex with all of these fantastic fellows here. It's not that they're weird or unattractive or strange or dangerous seeming when you meet them, or obsessive, or in fact, obviously, a danger to life and limb because they won't talk about anything on their dates other than cleaning their AR-15s to get rid of libs. Whatever it is, it results in less than optimal performance, let's say, on the dating scene, and they're pretty sure that that's a plot against them. And every once in a while, one of them loses their minds completely and decides that they're within their rights to go and kill all the people who refuse to go out with them because they were creepy and weird. Because they're not creepy and weird. It's just that other people are being brainwashed into believing that it's creepy and weird to say that the number of guns you own and the number of times you work out at the gym should entitle you to sex. I just told you I have guns and I lift. Why aren't we having sex right now? Right? So there are people who have come to believe this, and that this is the way of things, and it's the woke brain virus that is getting in the way of convincing today's young women that they ought to believe exactly that. And, that's kind of dangerous and wrong. And it's weird that there's a political party that believes that as a central tenet. Don't you think? All right. I do. Anyway, let's see. Winding down here and facing the end of the show and the end of the week. Maybe I'm scrolling a little further back to see what other things we might share. Why not throw this in here? Let's go to the Atlantic if they'll still allow us to see this thing. Sounded like an intriguing subject, but yeah, we're going to be able to read the whole thing. Probably not, but I wonder whether the pocket version is still available to us of this piece from the Atlantic. Can I still see enough to get the correct author here? Brian Klaas, Klaas, writing, "Asymmetrical conspiracism is hurting democracy." Feels like maybe a good transition from what we were just reading. In the past decade, conspiratorial thinking has shifted from a worrying factor in Republican politics to a defining feature. Seems like it's very similar in its take here. As an American living in Britain for the past decade, lucky you, except for the whole Brexit thing, I've had a front row seat to two dysfunctional democracies hell-bent on embarrassing themselves. I guess so. President Donald Trump warned that a hurricane was, quote, one of the wettest we've ever seen from the standpoint of water. That's embarrassing, but I wouldn't have chosen that necessarily as the example. Prime Minister Liz Truss failed to outlast a lettuce at Downing Street. These years have not inspired confidence in democracy. In Britain and the United States, and across most faltering Western democracies, this democratic dysfunction is routinely chalked up to a catch-all culprit: polarization. The reason our democracies are decaying, we're often told, is that we're more divided than ever before. And that's true. Polarization is worsening. Debates over Brexit and Trump tore citizenries and families, as we just recently saw, apart. But Britain's and America's democratic woes are not all the same. The problems in American democracy are worse. That's because a particularly insidious disease, woke mind virus from the other side, disease has infected the core of its political system, one that is not present to the same degree in other rich democracies: extreme conspiracism. Other countries, including the UK, have polarization. America has irrational polarization, in which one political party has fallen under the spell of conspiratorial thinking. Polarization Plus, this conspiracist tendency risks turning run-of-the-mill democratic dysfunction into a democratic death spiral. The battle for American democracy will be a battle over reality. Within the modern GOP, conspiracy theories about stolen elections, satanic cults, or deep state cover-ups have replaced policy ideas as a rallying cry for Trump's MAGA base. Trump's disciples have developed an encyclopedic knowledge of a dizzying cast of characters, along with a series of code words for alleged cover-ups. They rattle off their accepted wisdom about conspiracies that most people have never heard of, such as Italy-gate, the absurd notion that the U.S. Embassy in Rome, in conjunction with the Vatican, used satellites to rig the 2020 presidential election. In Britain, far fewer people believe in conspiracy theories. According to YouGov polling, a third of Americans believe that a small group of people secretly runs the world, while just 18% believe the same in the United Kingdom, where at one point a small group of people actually did secretly or openly run the world. So that's odd. Similarly, 9% of Americans think COVID-19 is a fake disease. In Britain, the figure is just 3%, although I would argue both of those numbers are pretty marginal. 17% of Americans agree with the statement that a secret group of Satan-worshipping pedophiles has taken control of parts of the U.S. government and mainstream U.S. media, compared to just 8% of Britons. What's really troubling about this political moment in America, though, is not merely the spread of conspiratorial thinking in the general population. It's also that the delusions have infected the mainstream political leadership. The crackpots have come to Congress. When Kevin McCarthy finally became Speaker of the House this week, one of the first photos to circulate was a selfie taken with Republican Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, a former QAnon believer, still QAnon believer, who once blamed the wildfire on Jewish space lasers. Writing a similar sentence about modern British politics would be impossible. There's just nothing like it. Instead, in Britain, conspiracy theorists are ostracized by the political establishment. Politicians may disagree about policy, but those who disagree about reality face real consequences. Last week, for instance, Andrew Bridgen, I don't know, I'm not familiar, but a conservative member of the British Parliament tweeted a graph from a conspiracy theory website spreading false information about the risks of COVID vaccines. The vaccination program, Bridgen wrote, was, quote, the biggest crime against humanity since the Holocaust, unquote. Wow. Response was swift. Bridgen was condemned across the political spectrum. His own party expelled him. The Tories, Britain's ruling conservative political party, didn't want to be associated with a conspiracy theorist. Meanwhile, America's political right is the leading global source of COVID conspiracy theories. The more outlandish, the better. 2 years ago in Ohio, in an almost exact parallel to Bridgen's remarks, Republican State Representative Jennifer Gross compared mandatory vaccination to the Holocaust. Then Gross went much further. She effusively praised the testimony of a quack expert who claimed that the vaccines magnetize people, such that spoons will stick to your forehead following a shot. What an honor you have here, Gross fawned, after the alleged expert testified that vaccines can, quote, interfere with 5G cell towers. Gross faced no primary challenger and was recently reelected with 64% of the vote. Rather than getting expelled from the Republican Party or becoming pariahs on the right, conspiracy theorists have become GOP stars. Mike Flynn, Donald Trump's former national security advisor and a former top intelligence official, has falsely suggested that COVID-19 was created by George Soros, Bill Gates, and the World Health Organization to steal the 2020 election. In a separate statement, he argued that Yuval Noah Harari, the author of the best-selling book Sapiens, was a part of a plot to alter human DNA and turn us into cyborgs. All right. Flynn should be an irrelevant laughingstock. Instead, he's headlining right-wing conferences and commanding huge audiences. And I might remind you, was briefly National Security Advisor to the President of the United States. Flynn recently shared a stage at the deranged Reawaken event with Eric Trump, during which one speaker alleged that demonic satellites control voting in America. Donald Trump, America's conspiracist-in-chief, spoke to the conference by phone. Jonathan Gottschall, an expert on the links between evolution and human storytelling, has come up with a simple, compelling explanation for why people are innately drawn to conspiracy theories. We are, in his words, a storytelling animal. Our minds have evolved to latch onto stories to make sense of a maddeningly complex world. Unfortunately, conspiracy theories are some of the best stories out there. They're thrillers. Many would make great blockbuster films, and to debunk a conspiracy theory is to tell someone that there is no story. It's trying to convince a person who has made sense of patterns by squinting at them through the funhouse mirror of conspiratorial thinking that those patterns are meaningless. That's not a message the storytelling animal wants to hear, although there was a pretty good story told on just that subject, The Beautiful Mind, and I mean, we're open to hearing that story if we want to tell it right. All humans of all political persuasions are susceptible to conspiracy theories. Millions of Americans on the political left and the political right believe in them, but conspiratorial thinking is thriving especially on the right because it's sanctioned and endorsed from above. This asymmetrical conspiracism has been going on for a while now. The historian Richard Hofstadter noted how the paranoid style took root in the right in the mid-20th century, starting with McCarthyism and continuing through, well, I guess today's McCarthyism, through Barry Goldwater's rise in 1964, shortly after John F. Kennedy was assassinated. In the past decade, conspiratorial thinking has shifted from a worrying factor in Republican politics to a defining feature. This is partly because of Trump himself, who peddled countless debunked conspiracy theories, including that climate change is a hoax invented by China and the lie that Ted Cruz's father had links to the JFK assassination. That should have rang all the bells. As Trump took over the party, his conspiratorial lies became Republican orthodoxy, and that opened the door to conspiratorial influencers who started inventing new lies. I am not nearly at the end of this article, but you might find it interesting enough to read on your own over the weekend, or you may want to turn your attention now to Justice Putnam with the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Coming up next.
You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
So you can always relax and unwind your brain with other horrific stories from around the country and around the world as Justice Putnam brings them to you on the next West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. We'll see you next week. Today being Friday, we sign off for the weekend. Time for Jared Santos to get crazy again. We'll see you on Monday.